Welcome to my review of Rolling Thunder 3 for the Sega Genesis. This is another Namco game that has passwords. It's very similar to the old Arcade Shinobi and Arcade Shadow Dancer games. You basically have your, you have two planes pretty much that you fight on. You're either on the lower floor or the upper floor, and that's pretty much the main concept of the game. Like, you're pretty much always switching planes to try to avoid projectiles and damage. And you have certain doors you can enter to get more ammunition. Before each stage, you can also pick what weapons you want to bring. And I believe that they are temporary weapons. Like, when you pick them and use them for a level, I think you can't use them for the rest of the game, if I remember right. But I cover, all the basics of the game in the tutorial and how I beat it. So I'm going to post my, a link to my tutorial in the description, so you can check that out as well. And I believe it took me around 2.5 hours to beat this game, so it really wasn't too difficult. But it was a fun game, very solid. It really reminds me a lot of the old Shinobi arcade game. It's very similar to that. And the boss fights are pretty decent, pretty straightforward boss fights. They can be a little challenging. Some of them have, patterns that you have to learn. And once you learn the patterns, they're usually not too bad. A few of them I kind of just bullshitted my way through, as you can see here, because they weren't too difficult. There's a nice little variety. You have a few driving scenes like this motorcycle sequence, which, mixes things up a little bit. So I thought that was cool. And if you've played the Rolling Thunder games before, then you'll be familiar with how this game plays. They're all pretty solid games from what I played, but this one might be one of the easier ones from what I remember, but it was a good moderate difficulty. It was enjoyable. And it also has unlimited continues and passwords, so you can always start from the last stage you got to. Though, like I said, I think the weapons you use may permanently waste. Though I'm not 100% sure on that, but I probably cover that in the tutorial, since that's a pretty important detail of the game. I beat this game a few years ago, so it's not fresh in my mind. But I don't see a lot of coverage for this game, or I don't see it mentioned too much. And it's actually a pretty solid Genesis game. It's a fun action game. So yeah, I like the variety of, the stages all look a little bit different, but there's not a lot of different enemy types, and, you pretty much, each stage plays very similar with, switching planes. You're either on the upper floor or the bottom floor usually. But there are some vertical, areas where you have to ascend and climb up a bunch of floors. So that mixes it up a little bit. But see, a lot of it is just going to be, fighting and switching floors to evade attacks and shit like that. You can bump into the enemies and not get hurt as long as they don't hit you with an actual attack, like a kick or something like that. But you can bump into enemies. So I like that it's not one of those games where if you touch an enemy, you automatically take damage. And you can take a few hits. It's not like one-hit deaths like a lot of these kind of games. So that makes it a lot easier than the original Shinobi or Shadow Dancer for arcade. And of course, those Shinobi games were a simpler style than the Super Shinobi series, which is like Revenge of Shinobi and Shinobi 3 for the Genesis. Those games are a little bit more sophisticated than this game. They have a little bit more depth to them. You move in a much more, you can do more vertical movement. And there's a lot more going on in those newer Shinobi installments. This is kind of based on that simpler mechanic like the older Shinobi games for arcade. It plays much more like those. The first Rolling Thunder was a game in that style as well, so it's based off of those games, which pretty much I believe they stole from Shinobi. They got the concept from Shinobi, but did it well. So here you can see you're actually ascending vertically at that point. So, I mean, that was a little bit different. And now you have another vehicle scene where you're on a jet ski. Kind of reminds me of Shinobi 3 with the jet ski level a little bit. But yeah, there's a nice variety. But like I said, it's mostly going to be, those type of levels where you're either on the first or second floor and just evading enemy fire. And this is the weapon select screen. See how it says used? Those are the ones that I already used. And they may permanently be used up once you select them for a level. Or maybe after you use a continue, it comes back. I'm not sure about that. Like I said, I haven't played this in a few years. So that's why my commentary on this review is not great. You know what I mean? I don't have a lot of shit to say, but it is a pretty simple game. I mean, there's really not that much to say about it. This boss was kind of interesting where you had to switch, different planes and move from one side to the other. There was a little bit more to this boss fight than some of the other ones. It's not hard once you know what to do. There's but a definite pattern to it. And, a lot of the bosses are like that. But as I said, the game as a whole really wasn't too difficult for this kind of game. So it's a good moderate difficulty game, and it's forgiving in the fact that it gives you unlimited continues and passwords. So you can just keep trying and learn the stages. I always recommend using save and load state to practice sections of stages if you're having trouble, like bosses, things like that. Efficient practice will allow you to beat these kind of games much quicker. But it's not that hard of a game overall. The last boss is a little tricky, which I'll show. And of course, going indoors, you can get different weapons. But they're temporary weapons that only last for a certain amount of time. I think you can select between them. So yeah, I believe this is the final boss. This is the first form. And a lot of these old games, I do show final bosses in the reviews. Because these games are, 20, 30 years old. I mean, it's not much of a spoiler by this point. The first form is pretty easy with the technique I use here. You just jump and duck at various points until this first form is dead. And then the second form can be kind of tricky, which you'll see in a moment. He has some tricky patterns with the lasers that can be a little bit tricky to dodge. But I found that if I stayed in this one area right here, I could just, duck, shoot, and jump as needed without moving and just defeat the boss that way. So I recommend doing that, which I explain all this in the tutorial. I go into detail about everything I did to beat the game. So check that out if you want to make the game a little bit more enjoyable to go through. It might save you some time. You might find the tutorial entertaining, so I recommend checking that out. That has full commentary and everything I did. I try to give detailed breakdowns, all the strategies I use. And of course, I do the tutorials while the game is still fresh in my mind. Unlike this fucking review, where I haven't played in a few years. Yeah, so after you beat this game, you get a password for a hard mode, which I haven't tried. But you can always do that, so there's some replayability there. And overall, I give this game a 7 out of 10. Thanks for watching.